Lynette was my personal most anticipated character going into Fontaine, but to be fully honest, there were a number of things that disappointed me quite a bit with her kit. But in the same breath, there were also a number of different things that truly did impress me. It was just way different than I expected. As a result, she landed a place, in my opinion, as a staple early game must-build unit, a very strong option for some late game niche teams, and even strong viability as a driver and carry if you're someone who sims for her. Overall, she is a very welcome addition to the Fontaine roster. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Lynette is an off-field damage dealer with significant supportive utility and the capability to be an on-field DPS and driver at C6. For early game players, she is an invaluable exploration unit as well as being a VV unit, and for late game players, she has quite a few teams that she's really solid in, although rarely the best in slot. But let's get into more detail with her pros and cons. Her first strength is that at Constellation 0, going into C4, she has pretty solid off-field damage, to the point where it actually is quite noticeable. She has amazing overworld exploration, and one of my characters to be able to explore Fontaine with. She even has the ability to dash and jump out of the water, which is such a cool mechanic that's only added to the Fontaine characters such as her. So overall, in my opinion, she is a must-have for exploring Fontaine, and a must-have for free-to-play players and new players who haven't yet got your copy of SLaN to explore as well. Being this good at exploration while being a Viridescent Venerer holder, in my opinion, makes her a must build for new players. She gets also a tiny bit of crowd control with her Constellation 1, and with her taunt, that crowd control is made slightly better. She has good constellations overall that add a lot more damage and more options for her kit. Her taunt also gives some defensive utility. She gives minor buffing to her party from attack. A lot of times you're going to be getting a 16% attack buff to all of your characters. And with Constellation 6, she gets an Animo infusion from her skill and has really good scalings that actually allow her to compete semi-close to the likes of Wanderer and Zhao. And while not quite on the same level, it is roughly in the same ballpark if you have Constellation 6 Farazan, which means that if you are a big Lynette simp, you can actually get quite a bit of damage out of her while being an on-field carry, which is not something that you can say for a lot of 4-star characters. She does have a few weaknesses though, especially that her grouping really leaves a lot to be desired when compared to that of Kazuha or even Sucrose. Her taunt doesn't always work on bosses, especially big single target ones, and you could call it a con that she has a fair bit of power locked behind her constellations, although I would say that she's good enough at C0 that it's not a huge problem. For her value and power level, I've already talked about it a fair bit, but I do think she's as close to a must build as you can get for new players because of her high damage you're going to get from swirls in the early game, the use of Viridescent Venerer in the mid game, and the exploration that you'll get always. She has a really low value for seasoned accounts, which is the main reason that I personally felt a little bit disappointed. She doesn't really hold a place in my account as the best choice on any team, but I recognize the fact that not every character can have a niche that they're best in, and she is really solid and good at what she does. As for how she feels to play, I think she feels pretty nice. Using her off-field, she feels great in a Wanderer team. It's honestly my favorite version of Wanderer right now, which is the team that I'm using her most on. And I have tested out C6, although I unfortunately have not tested out with C6 Farazan, which is really needed to bring her power level up to comparable levels to Wanderer. But I do find her really fun to play. And again, if she's someone that you really love, I think it's great that Hoyoverse created the space that she can be really strong if you invest into her. So overall, great value for new players, probably not so good for veterans. Looking at her teams, being as an off-field Animo damage dealer, she has a ton of teams. And with her Animo infusion at C6, she gets even more teams. Again, this is my personal favorite utilization of Wanderer. It's kind of a hybrid in between you don't need to use a shield, but she still gives you defensive utility with the taunt. It could be that as I get better and better at playing Wanderer and I don't need to use a defensive utility at all, except for Bennett, it could be that I won't like Lynette as much, but for right now, because I find the damage with a shield off-field is a bit lacking in this team, Lynette is perfect for me, and so this is my favorite team for her at C0. But it's by far not the only team that she can work in at C0. You can slot it into something like a Linny team, or really any other team that needs an off-field Anemo, but be warned, she will be a lot worse than Kazuha in all of these situations, especially in AoE where you need the grouping, and so I would say that her peak performance at C0 is sort of limited. At C6, however, everything sort of changes quite significantly. Some sort of electrocharge team with Fischl, Xingqiu, and Faruzan is going to be a really nice choice. If you don't have C6 Faruzan, swapping her out for a Kazuha is going to work well here. Something like an Aggravate team also is pretty good, again with Faruzan being the ceiling. I was really impressed by the Freeze team actually. You get really good freeze uptime, and this was pretty much my favorite team for her. You also have the option for the Electrocharge with Beidou as well. Overall, as an Anemo character, she really has a bajillion teams that she can work in, and so you can honestly mix and match, especially if you do have that C6 Faruzan, then you can kind of throw her into any combination. Even something like a Mono Pyro team is going to be really good too. When it comes to building her, you're actually going to do it somewhat differently than a lot of Anemo characters. You don't absolutely need to get her up to level 90 the way you do for a lot of Anemo. Obviously, if you're building as an on-field hyper, you know, as with all hyper carries, leveling them to 90 is a good idea to do eventually, but it's nowhere near the priority it is for characters like Electro characters in Hyper Bloom, Anemo characters that are focused on Swirl. It's not like that. It's one of the actually lower value characters in general to take to level 90. So personally, I'll be probably leaving her at level 80 unless I really decide to try and min-max her. For talents, you want to focus first on her burst, then on her skill, and if you are at C6, you definitely want to focus on leveling up her normals as well, because obviously you're going to be using that Anemo infusion, so you want to get that up. Unlike a lot of Anemo characters, you do get a lot of value out of her bursts and skill because you are building for talent damage, so getting them to a reasonable level like 8 is probably what you're going to want to aim for if you're going to be using her seriously. For weapons at Constellation 0, the main thing you want to prioritize is energy recharge. I've been personally loving Sacrificial Sword at Constellation 0 the most, but Favonius Sword, the new pipe weapon, even the Skyward Blade are all really good choices. Once you do get to Constellation 6, switching over to a damage type sword, such as the Jade Cutter, Mist Splitter, that's what you're going to get the most damage from and the more returns, especially if you do have that Constellation 6 Faruzan. You want to be investing and putting as much as you can into her because she's going to be doing a higher portion of the team's damage. For artifacts at Constellation 0, Virides and Venerer is by far going to be the best set if you're using her as an off-field support. The only situation where it's not at Constellation 0 to 5 is in a Wanderer team where you want to build her for damage, and her best personal damage artifact set is the brand new Marching Band Hunter artifact set. Yeah, that's what it's called. You're going to want to aim for an Energy Recharge Sands, Anemo Damage Goblet, and Crit Rate or Crit Damage Hat. This can change at Constellation 6, where instead of Energy Recharge, you can go for Attack Sands on your substats. You might need to get some Energy Recharge from your substats of your other artifact sets, even at Constellation 6. At 0, I've been comfy with around 220 Energy Recharge with the Sacrificial Sword, so aim for 200 plus, but it really does depend on your team. You want to test it out. And at Constellation 6, I think around 140 can work. Maybe you can get away with less as well. For Constellations, we've talked about them a lot, but her C1 gives you a bit of crowd control, but it's not that great. I have noticed that you get a bit more consistent crowd control when you do your holdy rather than your tappy, so give that a try. Her C2 increases your damage a pretty nice amount, same with your talent level from your C3 and your C5. Your C4 gives you that second charge from your skill, which is amazing for exploration and reduces your ER requirements by quite a lot. And then of course we've talked a lot about the C6 damage infusion that gives you Anemo damage from your normals after you use your skill. So one gameplay tip with that is you do want to use your burst first and then use your skill so you get more uptime on your sword Anemo infusion. For future prospects, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is she might be even more valuable of a character depending on how tough the Uja and Numa mechanics are in the Abyss. I don't think as far as her teams go, she's going to get like a whole ton of new teams in the future. I think she already has so many teams already, and C6 Faruzan already gives her that ceiling damage bonus that you would look for in a character like this. So I think she's pretty well fleshed out. We'll just keep an eye on that Uja Numa mechanic, which might make her more valuable for veteran players to go for. Something I probably should have talked about in the value section, but oh well. Versus the other animo characters in the roster, I think she's in a better spot than characters like Jean or Sayu, simply because having your animo slot do damage is generally a little bit better than having your animo slot that heals, mostly because you have already Bennett who heals and buffs, and it's really hard to compete with that. A lot of teams you'll be running on do use someone like Bennett or use someone like Baiju or Kirara, which is just a more valuable combination than something like Jean. There's more opportunity cost. You'd rather your animo character does some buffing or some substantial damage, and she does a decent amount of buffing and a decent amount of damage. So I think she's sort of in the mid-range of animo characters as far as a support. The biggest downside is her real lack of grouping, and she really can't replace Kazuha or Sucrose in AoE. And then in Constellation 6, she becomes a competitor to on-field carries like Wanderer or Zhao, where she definitely doesn't quite reach their level, but at C6, she's actually quite a bit closer than a lot of 4-star DPS characters. If we look at the 4-star DPS characters we have that are on field, such as Ningguang or Noelle or even Heizo, she comes out quite a bit closer to the 5-star counterparts than they do at C6, which is really nice if you've been wanting to build out your Lynette. I wish that more 4-star characters had this option to become an actual competent carry with higher constellations, and it's really nice to see Hoyoverse doing this. We've talked about the overworld a lot. I think for a new player who doesn't have Yelan, this is really valuable. It becomes even better when you have 2 charges at your Constellation 4. Probably not a ton of people are getting a Constellation 4. I got Linny and didn't even get a single copy of Lynette, unfortunately. But if you do end up with a C4, that's going to make her probably a staple on your overworld teams. And for her aesthetic, I think she has an absolutely fantastic design. I'm a really big fan. This is one of my favorite colors. Might even be my favorite color overall. So I'm really big fan of the design, the color scheme, and the real cat ears. I think she's the only real cat girl except for Diona. And I think the magic vibe and her vibe with Linny and how she was in the Archon quest, I love it. Her voice lines are great. What else is new? Genshin knocks out of the park again. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. We just passed 10,000 subscribers. Thank you so much. If you want to support me, please check out my Patreon. If you want to join an awesome Genshin community, definitely come join the Discord. And if you don't want to do any of those things, that is totally fine. Just watching the video has been more than enough. Thanks so much, and bye for now.